One quick bit of news before we go live to Israel. A rocket fired from Gaza has struck an area on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, where our correspondent, Karl Bostic, is. There was damage to cars and infrastructure. A 45-year-old man was injured by shrapnel. Most rockets fired from Gaza are intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. Well, let's go straight away to the Israeli city of Tel Aviv, where Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic is waiting to talk to us. Good to see you, Karl. First of all, let me just ask you about that rocket fired from Gaza, which was said to have struck an area on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. What more can you tell us?
Charles, actually, it's very interesting that you should bring that up because I'll be honest with you, we hadn't had any rocket fire or sirens for at least the past 2 or 3 days. An indication of just how effective Israel's offensive has been in Gaza, an indication that Hamas is in the retreat. What was really unusual is this, Charles, because I recall when it happened specifically, it was like midday, 12 noon. At the beginning of the war, for the first month, it was like almost like clockwork. You never heard sirens. You didn't have rockets until the late afternoon, like 5 o'clock or afterwards, and punctually always between 8 and 9 o'clock dinner time every night. That's how it was, Charles, for the first 6 weeks. This is the first time I can recall that you actually had rockets coming around midday. Some analysts here in Israeli media are speculating that it's because Hamas is so much on the retreat that they wanted to take that rare opportunity to still fire and strike while they can. The rocket was apparently launched from southern Gaza, for one, but two, it also just simply shows that they still have rockets in their arsenal. Again, with an arsenal of 30,000 rockets, Charles, they've only fired out about 11,000 rockets. But the timing was unusual. And yes, one person was injured from the shrapnel. And I'm in Tel Aviv. This is a Tel Aviv suburb. It could have very easily landed here in Tel Aviv where I am.
Glad you're okay, because we obviously are concerned that you stay safe down there. But what is the latest that you're hearing, Karl, about what is happening in that southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis, which appears to be the focus of the Israeli military at the moment?
Well, that's right, Charles. There are basically three arenas or theaters of fighting right now in Gaza. Those two neighborhoods in North Gaza, Jabalia and Shajaiya, those are two strongholds where Hamas still has a presence, but 80% of Hamas, operatives, 80% of the city is under Israeli control. But Khan Yunis, this will be the decisive battle for the war, Charles. And that's where it's a city of 400,000. That's where you still have the command and control of the Hamas leadership. By command and control, we're talking about the leaders, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Def, the head of the military. That's their hometown, and the Israelis believe they're still hiding there. Charles, this is urban warfare at its worst or best, however you want to call it. You're showing those pictures because most of the civilians have evacuated Khan Yunis. So it's really thousands of Hamas fighters fighting with the Israeli troops in street to street, block to block fighting. That's why the casualty totals now more than 100, and it's going to go higher, Charles. And what's also more worrisome is that this is continually pushing civilians to the south of Gaza. Again, only a 25-mile long strip, a quarter the size of Abuja, Charles. Tens of thousands now on the border of Rafah. And as the UN Secretary General said, right now, he predicts a breakdown in public order, in civil order. With tens of thousands there, some analysts and officials are saying that Israel wants to make it dangerous and miserable enough there on that border of Gaza because of what's happening in Khan Yunis for them to actually even pressure them into going into Egypt.
And Karl, we've had another threat from Hamas in the last 24 hours or so, where it has said that not a single Israeli hostage will be allowed to leave Gaza alive unless its demands are met, which includes a prisoner exchange and more humanitarian aid. What's your assessment of that?
Well, that's what's interesting, Charles. From the very beginning, the twin objectives were eradicating Hamas, number one, number two, rescuing all the hostages. But they're kind of incompatible because one undermines the other. The success of that humanitarian pause led to the release of about 100 hostages or so. Now, the window has closed. In fact, Charles, you've got the National Security Advisor to the White House from Washington, Jake Sullivan, arriving at the end of this week, Charles. Publicly, they're saying he's arriving to meet with Netanyahu and his war cabinet to again, push for an increase in humanitarian aid and to discuss the future of Gaza the day after the war. But beneath all of that is concern about rescuing the hostages, because, Charles, you need to keep this in mind. Israel has weeks, if not months, to eliminate Hamas. But when it comes to the hostages, every day of fighting is a day lost, perhaps, for the lives of many of those hostages who are elderly. Already, some estimates say, when you say 137 hostages are still being held, some people are very, very frank about it. 137 may be the official number of hostages, but that does not mean they're all alive. Already there are unofficial estimates, Charles, that 20 may already be dead.
And briefly, Karl, because we're almost out of time, the humanitarian crisis, of course, still escalating. People living in dire conditions without winter clothes and without enough food and medicine. As we're told, the death toll has now risen to more than 18,000, and people are told to move again.
Charles, there's nowhere else to run. And that's why I was talking about pressure building on Egypt's border. The head of WHO yesterday said that the healthcare system of Gaza is near collapse, and the UN Secretary General says it's a civil breakdown, public breakdown is expected right now, Charles. They're moving to a safety zone where there's no shelter, no food, no water, no medical care, and the spread of disease is very, very high right now because there are no latrines there, Charles. Already, it's 400 families at best to a single latrine, Charles, and yet where they are no latrines. So it's just a recipe for just a catalog of horrors, Charles. No food, no water. The hospitals, no beds, no sutures for injuries, no anesthesia for deliveries of babies. I mean, it's terrible, Charles, and unfortunately, it will get worse. And that's why there's pressure for a ceasefire. Last thing I'll say is that the UN Security Council sent envoys to the Egypt-Rafah border crossing to inspect the damage, and that's why there will be a vote tomorrow at the UN General Assembly tomorrow in New York, calling for a non-binding resolution of a permanent ceasefire. And so we'll see more activity on that front tomorrow, Charles.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Karl, and do stay safe. Karl Bostic is our special correspondent. He was talking to me there from Tel Aviv in Israel.